It's time to talk about something that isn't there. The history of Britain after the Romans left. After we left misty Albion with the Roman legions, the island must have been abandoned by all literate people. Historical evidence disappears, and all that can be found is a decree issued in Ravenna by Honorius, which officially authorizes the inhabitants of the province to carry arms to defend themselves against barbarian raids. Somewhere in the dust of ancient Roman archives, there is one more mention of England, the most recent for 440, and again, a refusal of the request for help. On the territory of England itself, there is not a single written source that can somehow shed light on what was happening there in these dark times. Yes, Christians destroyed ancient books. Yes, they reused ancient books to write something of their own over worn text. But in England, after the pagans took it over, there were no ancient books left either, and nothing new had been written in 2 centuries. When the books and letters are gone, the scholar picks up a trowel and a shovel. But even here, he is disappointed. All that can be observed is the traces of former Roman settlements, from which it can be established that the population left the cities, stopped constructing buildings, no longer built bridges, and did not lay roads. If in Gaul there remain partly Roman villas, some of which have even given their modern topographical names, here too we encounter a setback. All the villas of the Romans in Britain were abandoned. The population built exclusively perambulations around hilltop villages. Archaeologists determine the age of finds by the accompanying coins, so there are virtually no coins in 5th and 6th century Britain either. They were not minted, not brought from the continent, and only used as jewelry, stringing gold coins on beads. What is the difference between Britain and at least the same neighboring Ireland, whose history we can restore, for example, on the Annals of Ulster? Some monks once a year scribbled a single short sentence in Latin, but we already know who ruled in what year. Whether there was a big battle, we can say for sure that in Ireland they followed the emperors of Rome and so on. There is nothing like that in Britain, and the answer is simple. There were no monks in Britain. The Irish pirated just the same, built forts just the same, lived and died just the same, and yet there were people in Ireland who learned Latin, read books, and wrote something of their own. Though it didn't look so sad at first. Abandoned by the state, left to themselves, the Romano-British still felt themselves one with the empire and maintained some connection with the continent. For example, the island was visited by Saint Herman of Auxerre, who left memories of how he successfully defeated the local Pelagians in a debate and also took part in repelling one of the pirate raids, shouting "Hallelujah" from an ambush to scare the Saxons, who fled to their boats. Things began to change when the local ruler Vortigern the Skinny invited the Saxons of Hengist and allowed them to settle in the southeast of England in Kent as federates. It was a good idea. By that time, the Western Roman Empire relied entirely on barbarian armies in all conflicts. With the help of their barbarian seafarers, the Britons hoped to dissuade the Picts, the Irish, and the Germans from the continent from constantly raiding the island. The Saxons, in turn, were given a convenient location, securely protected by the sea from Attila the Hun's sprawling empire. In all ages, the government fails to fulfill its promises to the population. Usually, the populace expresses dissatisfaction, but in the face of the army and law enforcement agencies cannot enforce the punishment of the deceivers. In the case of the federates of the late Roman era, things were different. As soon as Vortigern confronted the Saxons with the fact that he could not pay for their services according to the treaty, the Saxons revolted and slaughtered the noble Britons, who had invited them to a feast. The Night of the Long Knives marked the beginning of the conquest of the eastern part of Britain, to which more and more Angles, Saxons, and Jutes gradually moved from the troubled continent. Whether Vortigern actually lived when London and other cities were captured from the Britons, all this is hidden in the mists of history. Germanic pagans spread across the island and drove the last literate people, Christians, further and further west. Incidentally, this is a good example of the development of an area in the Roman Empire that was unaffected by Christianity. Indeed, the Christianization of England by a second round did not begin until 597 by St. Augustine in Kent. Thus, The people of Britain were able to develop without fanatics and obscurantists for about 150 years. The initial infrastructure in the form of towns, roads, mines, and farms on the island was there. Alas, the locals did not show any successes, except in composing fairy tales about dragons, elves, and maidens coming out of the lake with swords. To finish a brief review of the state of Britain in the middle of the 5th century, I want to tell you about the sources on which historians who compile genealogies rely. It was Nennius, a monk from Wales, who wrote the History of the Britons. His haphazard compilation of annals from Ireland and British authors before him is interspersed with legends and tales of olden times. It is to him that we owe the legends of King Arthur. The Welsh historian, of course, wrote mainly about the heroic resistance of the Britons against the onslaught of the Germanic kingdoms. In contrast, Bede the Venerable, a monk from the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, first wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the Angles, where he presents the Angles and Saxons as God's instruments sent to conquer, Christianize, and unite Britain into a single whole. Bede took much of the history of the Angles by reading Gilda and completely rewriting his chapter about those years. That is about the time we are interested in. Gildas the Wise, in his turn, wrote his book somewhere in the middle of the 500s, which is already very good, but he did not pay much attention to historical facts, as his sermon on the perdition of Britain is rather a denunciation of sinners, where he explains, using many quotations from the Bible, that the rulers of the Britons by their sins led their country to ruin and destruction at the hands of God's punishment in the face of the evil Germans. Sitting in Ireland, Gildas constantly makes geographical errors in describing Britain, but this is forgivable, since his purpose was more a spiritual instruction to posterity than a historical narrative. Be that as it may, in the midst of these 2 centuries, King Arthur, dozens of kingdoms and castles, giants, fairies, dragons, and knights, legends and songs are now splendidly housed. And who knows, maybe that's how it all happened. And what's more, maybe chronologies and historical documents only spoil everything, and the real good history is oral folk tales and legends.